but delightful to live through. You came into my life just like another season, not for long, just a time till you come my way this season.
Hey guys, how you doing? Today I'm going to be showing you my photo editing process so you can see the steps that I use to take a photo from looking like this to looking like this. There's a couple simple steps that I use that I'm going to go through with you in a second, but before that, if you're wondering why I'm outside, look no further. This is the reason, and this is the reason why I'm gonna probably keep doing these outside. Quick side note, so the things that I'm gonna be talking about in this video are not specific to Lightroom, but I'm gonna be using Lightroom, so I'm gonna be talking about it, but you can really adapt these techniques to any editing software of your choice. Let's get into number one, which is hue. Now, if you don't know what I just said, that's okay. So what you wanna do is you wanna go into your color settings, go down to hue, and the first thing I do is that I mess around with the hue until I get the colors that I want that match all of my images, you know, because most of my images go onto Facebook and Instagram, so I want them to all match to make my feed appealing. So I usually adjust the blues a little bit to make them a little bit lighter and give that nice tropical look. I also adjust the oranges a bit to make them a bit darker, and I completely pull out the greens because I don't have any greens in my image. That's disgusting. I'm kidding, it's not. It just doesn't go with my theme right now. I might change it, but for now, no greens. And the next thing I do is I sort of play around with the reds and yellows until they become the orange that I want. And once I've got all the colors set out, it's time to move on to number two. Number two is pretty simple. It's cropping and framing. Okay? So when I crop and frame my images, I always try and crop them portrait. I always try and shoot them portrait if I can, but if I can't, if it's a landscape image, I'll see if I can crop them portrait and see if they still look good. Because Instagram and Facebook, but Instagram especially, get a ton more engagement when your photos are portrait-wise because they take up more of the feed space. So that's what I try and do. I try and do portrait if I can, but if I can't, then, you know, you have to do landscape. So once I crop it to portrait, I then move into framing, which I try and keep to the rule of thirds. So it splits my screen into a grid, a 9-square grid that I try and frame up to make the important stuff on the line of the thirds of the grid, because that's just how the rule of thirds work and it looks more appealing. So that's an extremely brief overview of the rule of thirds. If you want me to do another video, let me know in the comments, because there's a lot to it, but I'm just skimming. I'm skimming at this point. Let's go. I think it might be time to switch up the location. Just wandering on the rocks now. See if we can find a nice place. Look at that though. Finally out of the sun. Thank you, Mr. Rock. Now on to the third point, which is exposure. And on that note, I'm just gonna sit like this so there's better exposure. So with exposure, it really depends on what image I'm using, because I'm never going to use the same exposure settings for every image, because that's just not how light works. Although some stuff that's too underexposed, you can't salvage that, and same with too overexposed. Sometimes the photo's just ruined, so that's why you sort of have to just be cautious of that. I can do a whole other video on that. So that's basically exposure. It really depends on the exact image that I'm shooting with. So I'll adjust that until I get it to how I want it to look, whether it's low, whether it's a dark image, whether I want it to be a dark, moody image, or a bright, happy image. So moving on to number 4, guys, which is blacks, whites, highlights, and shadows. So there's 4 dials in Lightroom. They're in most of the Adobe Suite programs. I'm not sure if they're in all editing softwares, but they basically allow you to adjust the whites, the blacks, the highlights, and the shadows of the image. It's similar to the contrast dial, but they're just more precise. Now moving on to number 6. Is that number 6? No, it's not. Moving on to number 5, which is clarity and texture. In Lightroom, there's 2 dials, texture and clarity. And clarity In my opinion, it just makes you look like you're using a way better camera than you actually are. It brings out all the edges while bumping up the contrast and just makes it a lot more sharp. Kind of like what sharpness does, but it does a lot more. And texture just basically brings out all the edges of the image and all like the little crevices and just makes them pop, so it looks like an extremely textured image. And moving on to the sixth one this time, which is saturation. Now this is a big one on my images because I try and keep it consistent throughout every single one of my images. So I usually use a what's the word? Oh, I can't think of the word, but I use a comparison image, one that I've already edited and that's finished, that I use to compare the photos to make sure that I get the same colors, the same saturation. But for most of my photos, my saturation's bumped slightly down, or quite a lot down actually, because I don't want it to be in your face. I want it to just be nice and mellow and just fit into my feed without like obnoxious colors, if you know what I mean. And I also make sure it crops well in the Instagram box, so I always go into Instagram just to double check that. That is all the steps I take to edit my photos. Now, you guys can go and try those out. I hope you can use them in your everyday life, editing photos or doing what you do. And you can always send me a message because I'm always happy to give some editing advice with editing photos or videos. But yeah, that's everything. I hope you gained some value out of this and I hope you enjoyed. If you like this video, please give it a like. And if you like my stuff, consider subscribing. It's a worthwhile investment, I guarantee you. So my arm is actually dying now, so I'm gonna say goodbye. I hope you guys enjoyed and I'll see you guys next week. Peace.